Today, listen carefully for examples of exaggeration in this tall tale about Paul Bunyan, a natural-born logger who moved to the American frontier from Maine. Even as a baby, Paul Bunyan was mighty big. How big? Well, he was so big that his parents had to use a covered wagon for a cradle. Did Paul really sleep in a covered wagon as a baby? As you might imagine, young Paul Bunyan had a big appetite. He gobbled up 5 barrels of porridge a day, and his parents had to milk 4 dozen cows every morning and evening just to keep his baby bottle filled. Do you think he really ate 5 barrels of porridge a day, or that his parents milked 4 dozen cows to fill his baby bottle? Paul was so big it caused some problems in the little town in Maine where he grew up. When he sneezed, he blew the birds from Maine to California. When he snored, the neighbors ran out of their houses hollering, "Earthquake! Earthquake!" Did Paul really blow the birds from Maine to California? Do you think a child can actually do these things? After that, Paul's father thought it might be better if Paul didn't sleep in town. He built a cot on a large raft for Paul and floated it off the coast. Paul slept on the raft for a few nights, but the floating cot didn't work out. When Paul turned over to sleep, he created gigantic waves that knocked down houses along the coast. Would parents really put their baby on a floating raft to sleep in the harbor? Eventually, Paul's father decided that the East Coast was just too small for Paul Bunyan. The only sensible thing to do was to move out west. So, the Bunyan family moved to Minnesota. If Paul was too big for the East Coast, why do you think his father thought it would be better out west? Why were people moving west? In those days, Minnesota was full of logging camps, sawmills, and lumberjacks. A lumberjack is someone who cuts down trees. The sawmill is where the trees are turned into boards. People use the wood from trees to build houses and to make many other things. Americans were moving west and building the country. When he grew up, Paul Bunyan went to work as a lumberjack, and what a lumberjack he proved to be! He made himself a giant axe with a handle carved out of a full-grown hickory tree. He could bring down a giant tree with a single swing of his axe. Could a man really make an axe with the top of a tree, or chop down a giant tree with just one swing of his axe? As the tree tipped over, he would yell, "Timber!" so the other lumberjacks had time to get out of the way. Everyone looked up to Paul Bunyan, way up. The other lumberjacks were full of admiration for him. Admiration means they thought very highly of him. The bosses were grateful for the amazing amount of work he could do in a day. Paul had a big heart, too, but one thing he always wished for was a true friend. There simply wasn't anybody else his size who could be his friend. That all changed during the winter of the big blue snow. It was called the winter of the big blue snow because it was so cold that everyone shivered and turned blue. Even the snow shivered and turned blue. It turned out that the two big blue furry things were two big blue ears, and connected to the big blue ears was a giant blue baby ox. Paul exclaimed, "The poor little fellow is half frozen." Paul carried the blue ox home, wrapped him in blankets, and fed him. The baby ox was so content that he took a long nap in Paul's big strong arms. When he woke up, he looked up at Paul, and do you know what he said? "Mama! Mama!" Then he gave Paul a big slobbery lick on the face. Paul laughed and said, "Babe, we're going to be great friends." And they were. In fact, Paul Bunyan and Babe the blue ox were soon inseparable. Inseparable means they could not be separated. Everywhere Paul went, Babe went too. The two of them worked together in the lumber camps. Paul chopped down the trees, then Babe hauled them to the river and dropped them in so they could float downstream to a sawmill. Remember that in order for settlers to farm new land, they sometimes had to prepare it for growing crops and building homes. They often did this by clearing the trees away from the land. Together, Paul and Babe did the work. The lumber company figured the best way to keep Paul Bunyan happy was through his stomach, so they hired a special cook to feed Paul and Babe. Why would the lumber company want to keep Paul Bunyan happy? The cook's name was Sourdough Sam. Sourdough is a kind of bread. Sourdough Sam was known for the giant flapjacks he cooked in the world's biggest frying pan. Flapjacks are pancakes. The colossal pan sat on an enormous cast iron frame. Colossal means unbelievably large. Every morning Sourdough Sam would build a raging forest fire underneath the pan. Then he would call for his two helpers, Lars Larson and Pete Peterson. Lars and Pete would grease up the pan by tying slabs of bacon to their feet and skating back and forth across the sizzling pan. Greasing a giant griddle with bacon on their feet and cooking over a forest fire sounds like more... Can you think of the word? That's right. Babe and Paul helped the lumberjacks solve all sorts of problems. Once there was a river that was full of twists and turns. Sometimes the trees would get stuck in the turns and never make it downstream to the sawmill. But Paul Bunyan thought of a way to fix that. He went to one end of the river and sent Babe to the other end. Paul grabbed the river and pulled in one direction. Babe pulled the other end in the opposite direction. Then snap! Just like that, all of the kinks were pulled out, and the river was as straight as an axe handle. Paul and Babe straightening a river is another example of what? Of course, this tightening operation left the river a good deal longer than it had been before, and there was a lot of extra water lying around. Paul and Babe worked together to dig 5 big holes to hold all the extra water. Nowadays, these are called the Great Lakes. Did Paul Bunyan actually create the Great Lakes? This is definitely another what? One day, the logging bosses got to talking. One of them said that the United States was a fine country to be sure, but it could still stand a little improvement. Paul Bunyan happened to overhear this conversation. He told the bosses he would see what he could do. He hitched up Babe and they started plowing south. As they plowed, they threw a great mound of dirt and rocks to the right and a smaller mound to the left. On the right side they made the Rocky Mountains, and on the left side they made the Appalachian Mountains. Paul Bunyan and Babe didn't stop until they had plowed a channel all the way south to the Gulf of Mexico. And the river that flows in that channel nowadays, that's what we call the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River was a very important means of transportation in frontier days and still is today. From that day on, Paul and Babe went around the country, using their size and strength to help anyone who needed it. Later, they dug the Grand Canyon as they made their way to the west coast of California. Did Paul really make the Grand Canyon? And when the wind blows just right from the west, you can still smell those infamous colossal pancakes cooking on the frontier. Do you think you can still smell those pancakes? Or is this just another exaggeration?